This is the first lecture, Section 1, Lecture 1, and the information here corresponds with your textbook, Hook's U.S. Foreign Policy 2016 edition of Chapter 1. So, in this chapter we'll be looking at the U.S.'s place in the world. What is the U.S.'s place in the world? We'll be seeing how it's measured, but we'll also be seeing in subsequent lectures the challenges to the U.S.'s status relative to other nation states. The U.S.'s place in the world, according to scholars, is one of hegemony or primacy. A hegemon is a nation that exerts a controlling influence over all other countries and societies in the world that falls short of political authority, that is, outright control. Another way of saying this is that the hegemon is the most powerful nation state in the world, and this can be measured militarily, economically, also culturally. So if we look at the U.S.'s place in the world, we give it this name of primacy, being first. Well, this hasn't always been the case. Historically, any number of nation states could have been considered a hegemon. So for example, if we look from the 1600s through, say, World War II, there were any number of powerful nation states in the world at any given time. The Spanish Empire, the British Empire, before World War II, the rise of Germany, the rise of Japan, so on and so forth. Any of these nation states could have been a hegemon, so to speak, for the regions that they dominated. But after World War II, the world was bipolar. And so from 1945 till 1990, there would have been two most dominant nation states in the world, the U.S. and the Soviet Union. But in 1991, the Soviet Union voted itself out of existence. And so the only nation state that really rises to the rank of being a hegemon is the United States. So how do we prove that the United States deserves this place of dominance? How is it measured? Well, one way it's measured is what scholars call hard power. And this is power or influence through coercion or force. Military spending is part of our hard power. For example, on average from 2001 to 2013, the U.S. spent 43% of the world's military spending. In the 1990s, the U.S. accounted for over 50% of global military spending. In 2001, prior to September 11th, Defense Department spending was around $300 billion. But in 2011, after the war zone terror, as we were still in Iraq and Afghanistan and beginning to battle ISIS, our spending was around $700 billion a year. Currently, as of 2015 that is, U.S. military spending is around $600 billion a year because of the automatic budget cuts known as the sequester. How else can this be measured? Not just in money, but also in technology. So for example, the U.S. has the largest Navy in the world and the two largest air forces, the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. Navy. And according to one statistic I saw recently, we have 10,000 more military aircraft than the next largest military. That is a place of dominance. That is a place of primacy. That is a place of hegemony. And this underlies our national security strategy as a nation state to maintain that dominance. But this is not the only way that the United States is powerful or can influence other nation states in the world. We also hold this place of primacy or hegemony in economics. Economically, The U.S. has the world's largest gross domestic product. In 2015, this was $18.1 trillion. Next down on the list was China at around $10 trillion. We are the largest importer in the world. In 2014, the U.S. imported $2.35 trillion worth of goods. We are the second largest exporter in the world. So, for example, in 2014, we exported $1.8 trillion in goods and services. Similarly, the United States is the largest consumer market in the world. 28% of the world's consumerism, around $10 trillion annually. And we have the largest level of foreign direct investment in the world. This means that we are the highest sender and receiver of investments for private businesses, industries, services, so on and so forth. In 2013, there was an estimated $4.8 trillion sent to other nation states in the world, that is, invested in others' economies. And in that same year, the U.S. received $2.8 trillion in investments. This graph from your textbook shows the relative military spending of the United States versus all others in the world. Now this one shows a little bit lower percentage than I gave you later. This was an earlier statistic, and this is a later statistic. This is from 2014. So why the change? Well, a couple of things. We have reduced almost to zero our level of troops in Iraq, at least for a while until we went back to fight ISIS. We have reduced significantly also our level of troops and our participation in Afghanistan. And so this has lowered our spending naturally. But there are other considerations too. Other nation states have begun to spend more. So recently, Russia has announced that it's going to spend more and more money. China has been spending more recently, completing their first aircraft carrier, for example. Now, this is a strange visual representation of U.S. military spending, but it does show this relative place of dominance versus other nation states in the world. So the U.S. is there in a lighter color purple, representing the largest military spending in the world. Other nation states, China, Japan, France, the UK, Germany, are also relatively large relative to everybody else, but relatively small to the United States. And so you see the U.S. dominance in this visual representation. We can also see U.S. dominance in a visual representation here based on world economic output by GDP. And so, according to this statistics, 2014, the United States GDP was around $17.4 trillion, the next largest economy. One of the other large economies in the world was still $7 trillion behind. Well, if you look at the relative statistics of those other large nation states, that seems to be quite a bit, that $7 trillion. Because Japan, Germany, UK, France, Brazil, none of them are that high. So here's another strange map. This one has to do with the relative economic size of the United States. Here we can see that the United States is a little smaller than it was in military spending, China a little larger, but still the U.S. is dominant in that position of primacy or hegemony relative to all other nation states in the world. Both on this map and the previous one, you can see, for example, Africa, the poorest nation states in the world. Africa is the largest continent by far. Well, then, its relative place visually represented on this map to its economic size, then really can give you a representation of how large the U.S. economy is versus other nation states. Hard power is not the only way to measure the U.S.'s influence in the world. Scholars have also begun to discuss soft power, and this is an idea that comes from a Harvard scholar named Joseph Nye primarily. What he examines is our influence culturally. Why would other nation states want to be like the United States? Well, he says it's because of the attractiveness of our institutions like democracy and open markets and individual economic attainment, and also our cultural values, social freedoms, and liberties. The examples of this can be seen in the dominance of U.S. television and film markets, the dominance of U.S. pop music, the dominance of U.S. technological advancements, Silicon Valley being the envy of the world, and the dominance of U.S. universities. So why would other nation states want to be like the United States? Because we have these attractive institutions, we have these attractive values, and we use these mediums like music, TV, film, technology to then influence other nation states in a softer way, showing them our values, the way we operate, and ideally then they'll want to follow our lead based on the attractiveness of these institutions and values. Part of that was, of course, that the United States has the top universities in the world. And this table is from your textbook. In 2015, 8 of the top 10 universities in the world were here in the United States. This is not only private universities, but also public universities like the University of California system you see there. We can see then the U.S.'s influence in education, perhaps, particularly college education. And many of you, of course, can see this in your fellow students. Tens, if not hundreds of thousands of foreign students come to the United States every year to study at U.S. universities. How would that lead to our influence? How do we lead to that power? Well, it's not something that can be measured easily, but nevertheless, they're attracted by our values, our institutions, right? And rather than us going to them, they come to us. That is a place of dominance. That's a place of influence, according to scholars. Now that we've seen what the U.S.'s place in the world is, we have to look at challenges to this place. What are the challenges to U.S. primacy, to our hegemony, to our dominance? Well, some of them are economic, and the list that I have here on this slide speaks to that. Globalization, particularly economic globalization, may be a challenge to our dominance, particularly because of an idea called the law of uneven growth. The basic idea here is that poor nation states will eventually catch up to rich nation states, and this is due to any number of factors: later industrialization, later technological adoption, using the benefits of markets and security and technology that comes from dominant nation states for their own purposes to bring themselves out of that relatively weaker position. This is also linked to an idea called long cycle theory, which has to do with the rise and fall of empires. And so if you think back to your history, the Spanish Empire, the British Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Japanese Empire, none of these exist anymore. They exist as nation states, but not as empires. That is because weaker nation states rose to challenge and overtake their dominance. They provided, during their times, relative peace, relative stability, but most importantly, economic markets under which the weaker nation states benefited and grew. And the empires during that time eventually got to a place of overreach. What this means is that they expanded their commitments beyond the point where they could sustain their military and economic dominance. It became too expensive to maintain their military and economic dominance. They were experiencing a diminished return in what their military and economic dominance bought them. And so then, under this situation, under this set of ideas, nation states that are relatively economically weaker, relatively politically weaker, or militarily weaker can use the benefit of the peace and economic stability under that dominant nation state to build their own economies, to grow, to flourish, and maybe eventually rise to challenge the power of the dominant nation state. And that's what power transition theory is about. Let's look on the next slides to see a visual representation of this. So this chart shows the law of uneven growth. We could say that this is economic indicator. So I'll put the US in red and country B, whatever you want it to be, in yellow. You can see over time that maybe the US has steady growth, but not exponential growth. The idea of the law of uneven growth or power transition theory is that other countries can use then the provision of peace and markets to take off much more quickly and to grow greater at a quicker pace relative to the dominant nation state. So I put 1970s as the indicator there. Let's say China is in yellow. In 1978, China began to industrialize to a greater extent and open its economic markets. And so they have taken off economically since that time. And some scholars predict that China will eventually surpass the United States in its economic might. And that's what we see on this chart from your book, the Global Power Index Forecast, that over time, well on to 2050, China will eventually rise economically, but also militarily, to challenge the US and the EU for dominance in the world. India, too, sees this great rise. Well, that's because they are newly industrializing nation states, at least relative to the others. And their growth then becomes more exponential because of this new industrialization than the service economies that are the dominant factors of the EU and the US.